$41,000 in cost overruns, 6 failed acceptance trials in 11 days. And 1 turbine casing on the destroyer Harrington Marine Dynamics had rebuilt for the United States Navy, sitting dead in its cradle for the 3rd time that morning, while 9 people in pressed shirts argued about why. Why does a decorated admiral, still addressed as Sir by 4-star officers who outrank him on paper, walk straight past the CEO of a $200 million contracting firm and kneel beside the mechanic she just fired? That is the question this story answers, and the answer starts on the dry dock floor at 8:14 in the morning with a man in a faded gray jacket saying 6 words that will end his employment before the Admiral's car has even cleared the gate. It isn't where, it's the bearing. Delphine Harrington did not look up from her tablet. She was 44 years old, dressed the way people dress when they intend a room to remember their composure rather than their face. And she had inherited this shipyard the way other women inherit a house they never chose the wallpaper for. Around her stood 4 propulsion engineers, 2 Navy liaisons in service dress, and Everett Landon, 38, kneeling at the base of the turbine housing with his palm flat against cold steel like a man taking someone's pulse. The wear analysis was run by a team with 40 combined years in marine propulsion, Delphine said, still not looking at him. You've been on this floor 18 months, as a mechanic. I know what I've been, Everett said. It was not a challenge. It came out level, almost gentle, the way a man states an address rather than an opinion. That, more than the words themselves, was what made the 2 Navy liaisons exchange a glance neither Delphine caught, because she was already turning to Preston Rhodes, the floor supervisor, with the particular stillness of a woman who has decided how a sentence will end before she finishes speaking it. Escort him out. Today. He's just a mechanic, and this floor doesn't have time for a mechanic's theories in front of the United States Navy. Preston didn't move as fast as she wanted. Nobody on that floor moved as fast as she wanted, not that morning, because at the gate a black government sedan was idling through the checkpoint, and inside it sat a man whose name would, in about 11 minutes, undo the sentence Delphine Harrington had just pronounced. Stay with this one to the end. The machine isn't the only thing in this story that was misjudged. 6 hours earlier, in a rented house 4 miles from the yard, the only failure Everett Landon was managing was a pot of oatmeal threatening to catch on a burner turned 1 notch too high. He lowered the flame with 2 fingers, the same unhurried motion he brought to everything, and behind him, at the kitchen table, Ruby Landon, 8 years old, was lining up her spoon exactly parallel to her bowl the way she lined up everything, watching him with the specific attention of a child who has learned to read a room by watching one man's hands. You put the flame down before it boiled, she said. You always know before it happens. Machines complain before they break, Everett told her. People usually do too. You just have to be listening already. It was the kind of thing Josephine used to say, in different words, from a different chair, 3 years and 2 months before that morning. Josephine Landon had been a Navy contracts auditor, sharp enough to catch a rounding error at 4 decimal places, and she had told him once, early in their marriage, back when he still wore railroad tracks on his collar instead of a frayed civilian jacket, to let them underestimate him, and then let the work answer for him. She had said it the week his division dissolved inside a merger that erased his name from a patent he had spent 4 years designing. She had said it again, quieter, in a hospital room 14 months before she died of the cancer that took her slowly enough for him to memorize every sentence she had left to give him. Ruby had been 5. She did not remember the hospital room. She remembered, she said once, only that her mother's hands had always smelled like the hand cream in the good years, and that her father's hands, afterward, began smelling like solvent and old rubber instead, because he had stopped commanding propulsion refits for the fleet and started fixing them from underneath, for a fraction of the pay, so that he could be home by 5:30 every day of Ruby's life. He checked her backpack the way he checked everything, not rushed, not anxious, simply thorough. Lunch, packed the night before, in the container she'd chosen herself for the cloud sticker on the lid. Homework folder. The stuffed whale with one eye that had ridden in that bag every day since kindergarten for reasons neither of them had ever discussed, and neither of them needed to. In his own bag, the same one he'd carried for 18 months at Harrington Marine Dynamics, sat his toolbox and taped inside its lid, a drawing Ruby had made of a gray ship on gray water, No figures in it at all. Beneath the drawing, wrapped in a shop rag gone soft with age, was a brass builder's plate stamped with a serial number that did not appear on any maintenance ledger in the country, salvaged years ago from an engine he had once rebuilt with his own 2 hands, under a different rank and a different name recognition entirely. He touched it most mornings before he left, the way another man might touch a photograph. He never explained why. Ruby never asked. She had inherited her mother's gift for knowing which questions could wait. At the yard that morning, the turbine casing sat open on its cradle like a patient mid-surgery, its inspection panel removed. 4 engineers clustered around a diagnostic readout that insisted, in green digital certainty, that everything about the machine was within tolerance. Cordelia Somerset, 33, lead propulsion engineer, stood with her arms crossed in the particular posture of someone defending a conclusion she had already submitted in writing. The vibration signature is consistent with bearing seat wear, consistent with age, consistent with everything we predicted in the maintenance model, she said, more to the Navy liaisons than to Everett, though he was the one who'd spoken. We've run the sensor array 4 times. Run it a 5th time, Everett said, and it'll tell you the same wrong thing, because the sensor's listening for wear. This isn't wear. Wear sounds like sand in a jar. This sounds like 2 gears built for different rooms. One of the junior engineers actually laughed, a short, surprised bark quickly swallowed. Cordelia did not laugh. She simply said flatly, "You're a floor mechanic," as though the sentence were itself a complete rebuttal, needing no further clauses, and around them 4 Navy liaisons in service dress said nothing at all, which in a room like that was its own kind of verdict. Delphine Harrington had arrived 11 minutes earlier for exactly this demonstration, dressed for the cameras that weren't there yet, but would be soon, once the contract renewal made this refit a press event instead of a private embarrassment. She checked her watch, a habit so ingrained she did it mid-sentence, mid-meeting, mid-anything longer than 15 seconds, and addressed the room the way she addressed every room, by function rather than name. Someone explained to me why the mechanic is contradicting 4 engineers in front of a Navy liaison team. Because the mechanic is right, Everett said, and did not raise his voice to say it, which somehow landed harder than if he had. The room's temperature seemed to drop by exactly that many degrees. Cordelia's jaw tightened. One of the liaisons, a lieutenant commander no older than 30, glanced toward Everett with something that wasn't quite belief yet, but wasn't dismissal either. A held breath, waiting to see which way the room would break. It broke toward Delphine. "This is a $200 million propulsion contract," she said, stepping closer to the casing, close enough that Everett could see the exact shade of contempt in the set of her mouth. "And I am not going to have it undermined by a man in a jacket with a frayed collar telling 4 credentialed engineers they've measured wrong. You don't get to be right here. You get to fix what you're told to fix when you're told to fix it, and today you're told to leave." "Ma'am, he's just a mechanic," she said to the room now, not to him as if he had already left it. "Escort him off the floor." Everett did not argue. He did not defend himself, did not list his 18 months of unblemished work, did not raise the possibility that the woman standing in front of him with her arms crossed and her watch already glancing toward the next 15 minutes of her day might be wrong about something more than a bearing. He simply looked at the casing one more time, the way a man looks at something he is leaving unfinished against his will, and said the only thing that came out of him with any weight at all. 2 minutes. Before I go. I'd like 2 minutes at the housing." It was Preston Rhodes who answered, before Delphine could refuse it. Preston, 52, who had hired Everett 18 months earlier without asking a single question about the 14-year gap in his resume, because something about the man's hands in that interview had told him everything he needed to know. "Give him 2 minutes, Preston said. "I'll walk him out myself after." Delphine's watch caught her eye again. She waved one hand, the gesture of someone granting a stay of execution she considered beneath her notice, and Everett knelt at the casing, the way he had knelt at 100 casings before this one, in a life none of them in that room had any reason to know about yet. He placed his palm flat against the housing first, the way he always did, before he ever touched a tool. He held it there, still, eyes half closed, the posture of a man listening to something none of the diagnostic equipment in the yard had been built to hear. Nobody spoke. Cordelia's arms stayed crossed, but her weight had shifted, almost imperceptibly, onto the balls of her feet, the stance of someone who did not want to admit she was watching closely. "There," Everett said, quiet, almost to himself. "Right there. 420 hertz, give or take. That's not the frequency this turbine was designed to run at. Somebody put a different bearing in this housing than the one that's on your approved parts list." "That's not possible," Cordelia said, but her voice had lost its earlier certainty, the words coming out more like a question than a correction. "I'd like to see the inspection log," Everett said. "The original sign-off, not the summary sheet. There'll be a timestamp and a part number on it. If I'm wrong, I've cost you 2 minutes and I'll walk out without another word." "And if you're right?" the lieutenant commander asked, the first thing any of the Navy liaisons had said aloud. Everett didn't answer that. He simply kept his palm against the metal, listening to a sound only he seemed able to hear, while behind him, unnoticed by everyone except Preston, who happened to be facing the gate, a black government sedan came to a stop at the checkpoint, and a tall man in a long wool coat stepped out of it with the unhurried authority of someone who had spent 30 years being the last person in any room to raise his voice. He walked the length of the dry dock floor without breaking stride, past the coffee cart, past 2 junior engineers who straightened automatically without knowing why, past Delphine Harrington herself, who opened her mouth to offer a greeting and closed it again when she realized he wasn't slowing down for her. He stopped 3 feet from the turbine casing, looked at the man kneeling there with his palm against the housing and his sleeves rolled to the forearm, and said the 2 words that would change the shape of everything Delphine Harrington believed about the morning she'd just had. "Commander Landon." Everett went still, in the way a man goes still when a name he hasn't heard in 14 years is spoken by the one voice he never expected to hear it from again. He turned his head, slow, and looked up at Admiral Spencer Fairbanks, 61 years old, retired and recalled for exactly this kind of oversight, and said nothing at all for a moment that stretched long enough for Delphine's face to shift through 3 separate expressions before settling on none of them convincingly. "It's just Everett now, sir," he said finally. "It was never just anything," Fairbanks said, and turned to the room, to Delphine specifically, with the flat authority of a man who did not need to raise his voice because no one in 30 years had ever needed him to. "This man co-designed this propulsion system 15 years ago, under my command, when your engineers were still finishing their degrees. If he's telling you the bearing's wrong, the bearing is wrong, and I'd suggest whoever fired him 5 minutes ago find a way to unfire him before I have to write that detail into my report." The silence that followed was not the silence of a room agreeing. It was the silence of a room recalculating, all at once, everything it had assumed about the man in the frayed jacket and Cordelia Somerset, still standing with her arms crossed, uncrossed them slowly, as if the gesture itself no longer made sense to hold. Delphine did not apologize. Not yet. She said only, "You designed this system," not as a question, and Everett, still kneeling, still with one hand resting on the housing like he was calming something that had been frightened, answered the only way he ever answered anything. "I designed it to run true. It isn't running true. That's not an opinion, ma'am. That's the whole problem." The inspection log arrived within the hour, carried across the dry dock floor by Preston Rhodes, with the particular care of a man handling something he already suspected was evidence rather than paperwork. He set it on the workbench beside the open casing and did not say anything at first, just watched Everett's finger trace down the columns, part number, date, sign-off, the way another man might read a pulse strip. "Here," Everett said and tapped a line halfway down the page. "Bearing assembly, part 441B. That's not what's on your original spec sheet. Your spec called for 441A. "One letter," Cordelia said, leaning over his shoulder now, no longer defending anything, just looking. "That's a manufacturer substitution. Happens all the time on back order." "Not on a Navy acceptance job," Everett said. "Not without a deviation request logged separately, signed by engineering and procurement both. There's no deviation request in this file." Preston had gone quiet in the particular way of a man doing arithmetic in his head that he did not like the answer to. "The sign-off timestamp," he said slowly, pointing to the corner of the page. "That's dated 3 weeks before the part actually shipped. I checked the freight manifest myself, back when I logged the delivery. Somebody signed off on a part before it existed in the building. Which means somebody typed a form to match a decision that had already been made, Everett said, and then made the part appear on schedule so nobody would ask questions about why it was different. Cordelia straightened, and for the first time since the morning began, her voice carried none of its earlier certainty, only a kind of careful, deliberate unease. That's not a maintenance error. That's not wear pattern misjudgment. That's a falsified inspection record. Somebody in this building authorized a substitution, Everett said, and then covered the substitution so it would read as routine. I don't know who yet. I know it wasn't a wear failure, and I know the part on that shelf never should have shipped. Preston flipped back through the log's earlier pages, hunting now instead of merely confirming, and found what he was looking for on the third page back. An authorization code in the procurement column, 6 digits, initialed but not fully signed, the kind of shorthand that meant something to whoever used it and nothing at all to anyone reading it cold. I don't recognize this code, Cordelia said. This isn't an engineering authorization. This routed through procurement. Then someone in procurement made an engineering decision, Everett said, and didn't tell engineering they'd made it. Nobody in the room said Howard Bishop's name yet. Nobody needed to, not out loud, not that morning. But Preston Rhodes, closing the logbook slowly, glanced once toward the far end of the yard where the procurement office sat behind its own glass partition, lights on, blinds drawn halfway, the particular half-drawn blind of a man who preferred not to be watched while he worked. By the following afternoon, Delphine Harrington had settled on the version of the morning she intended everyone to remember. She summoned Everett to her office, a glass box on the second floor overlooking the dry dock, decorated with framed photographs of ships that had never once required her to know their names, and offered him, across a desk too clean for a shipyard, a folder containing a bonus check and a single-page non-disclosure agreement. $15,000, she said, and a formal letter of reinstatement. We'll say the termination was a miscommunication. Nobody needs to discuss the Admiral's visit outside this building. You want me to sign something that says nothing happened, Everett said. It wasn't a question. I want this handled quietly, discreetly. You'd be compensated fairly for the part where you called me a mechanic in front of a room, or the part where the bearing that failed your trial wasn't a mechanical error at all. Delphine's watch caught her eye, out of habit, and for once she didn't look at it long enough to finish the gesture. That's an engineering matter. It's a records matter, Everett said, and it isn't going to stay quiet because Preston Rhodes already flagged the freight manifest to your compliance office this morning, and Cordelia Somerset is running the part number against every propulsion refit you've delivered in the last 2 years. If 441B shipped once under a falsified sign-off, ma'am, it likely didn't ship once. It took 11 days to trace the rest of it, 11 days during which the evidence arrived the way evidence always arrives once someone finally starts looking properly, smaller each time and heavier. A shell company registered in a name close enough to a real supplier to pass a glance and fail a search. A single wire transfer, $41,000, routed through that shell company into an account that shared its beneficiary details with exactly one employee of Harrington Marine Dynamics. And beneath all of it, buried 3 folders deep in a procurement archive nobody had opened in over a year, the digital signature of Howard Bishop, 47, Director of Procurement, on 11 separate deviation requests that had never once been forwarded to engineering for approval. He held, it turned out, a private financial stake in the very bearing supplier whose substituted part had failed the trial, a stake structured to profit precisely when Harrington Marine was forced into an emergency full turbine replacement contract, the kind of contract that would have been worth considerably more than the bonus Delphine had tried to hand a mechanic to keep quiet. He had not sabotaged the ship to hurt anyone. He had sabotaged the paperwork to make a machine look broken enough to justify replacing it, and had never once considered that someone might listen to the machine itself and hear the difference between a bearing that was worn and one that had simply never belonged there. The boardroom where it was laid out plainly, 6 days before the Navy's review board was scheduled to sign the contract renewal, held none of the theater the moment might have earned in a lesser telling. Everett stood at one end of a long table with Preston Rhodes and Cordelia Somerset beside him, 3 folders of evidence squared neatly in front of them, while Howard Bishop sat at the other end saying nothing at all. because there was, by that point, nothing left to say that the shell company's wire transfer hadn't already said for him. No. The deviation requests were never routed to engineering, Cordelia said, sliding one folder the length of the table. Every one of them carries your authorization code. Every one of them corresponds to a part substitution from the same supplier. The supplier in which you hold an undisclosed financial interest, Preston added, which we can confirm through the same beneficiary account that received $41,000 3 weeks before the sign-off date on this ship's turbine bearing. Bishop did not deny it. He simply looked at his own hands on the table, the way a man looks at hands that have done something he can no longer explain away, and said nothing that would be repeated afterward, because his exposure, once the room saw the numbers laid end to end, needed no further commentary from anyone in it. Delphine Harrington waited until the room had emptied before she spoke to Everett directly, the two of them alone at the long table, the folders still squared where Cordelia had left them. "I called you just a mechanic," she said, "in front of a room full of people, because you were wearing a jacket I decided told me everything about you before you'd said a single word. I was wrong about the bearing. I was wrong about the man kneeling next to it. And I didn't apologize the first time, because apologizing would have meant admitting I never once asked you a real question in 18 months. You're asking one now," Everett said. "I'm trying to," she said, and it was, for the first time since he had known her, entirely unguarded. "What do you want? Reinstatement with your commission title. A public statement correcting the record. Name it." He thought for a moment of Josephine, of a hospital room 3 years gone and 14 months long, of the particular way she used to fold her hands when she was about to say something true rather than comforting. She used to tell him the work would answer for him. He had just been waiting long enough to let it. "I don't want my title back," he said. "I don't want a statement. I want Preston's job protected. He's the one who flagged the manifest before anyone asked him to. I want Cordelia kept on this project, because she was wrong for an hour and right for the rest of her career, and that's more than most people manage. And I want every inspection sign-off in this yard to require 2 independent verifiers from now on, so the next Howard Bishop has to falsify 2 signatures instead of 1. Delphine looked at him for a long moment, the way a person looks at something they have finally, belatedly, learned to see clearly. "That's all?" "That's everything," Everett said, and meant it. By spring, the Navy's review board had signed the multi-year contract renewal with the 2 verifier safeguard written into its inspection protocol as a standing requirement, a small clause in a 200-page document that would likely never make a headline anywhere, though it would quietly outlast every executive who signed it. Everett Landon still worked the dry dock floor at Harrington Marine Dynamics, by choice, in the same faded gray jacket with the same frayed collar, though these days he spent as many afternoons teaching as fixing. Cordelia Somerset kneeling beside him at a casing, palm flat against the housing, learning to hear the 420 hertz of something built for a different room than the one it was running in. "You could have taken the commission back," she said to him once, months into it, not quite a question. "I already have the job I wanted," he told her, and did not explain further, because by then most of the yard had stopped needing him to. At home that evening, Ruby sat at the kitchen table with a fresh sheet of paper and a box of crayons worn down to stubs, working with the same careful concentration she brought to lining up a spoon beside a bowl. When she finished, she carried it to her father's toolbox, opened the lid where the old drawing of the gray ship had hung, faded and alone beside the brass plate for 3 years, and taped the new one beside it without a word. The same gray ship, the same gray water, but a small figure now standing next to it, labeled in her careful 8-year-old print. Dad. Everett looked at it a long moment, the way a man looks at something he has been waiting to be given without ever asking for it, and said nothing, because nothing needed saying. If you believe quiet competence deserves to be seen before it's too late, you already understand why Everett stayed.